Sidespan 2, the House on our companion network, C-SPAN. Now a discussion of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Today, a panel of academics discussed the issue at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee National Convention in Arlington, Virginia. Their comments and a question and answer period is an hour and 45 minutes.
Okay, while waiting for our third panelist, hello, my name is Hisham Alham. I'm going to relieve you from my prepared remarks because we need to have enough time for the Q's and A's after the statements. Suffice it to say that you rarely find an Arab who is ambivalent about America, and for a good reason. America is omnipresent in Arab life, politically, militarily, economically, and increasingly culturally. And for many Arabs, this omnipresent power is also omniscient. Our panelists will deal in the next hour and a half with one facet of American policy in the Middle East, that is U.S. approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Elaine. I will introduce the panelists, brief introductions since you have all the bios on them. And then afterwards, I'm going to ask them to stick to 20 minutes so that that will give us enough time for a lively, I hope, discussion. We will start with Yvonne Haddad. Yvonne Haddad is Professor of Christian-Muslim Relations and the History of Islam at the Center for Muslim-Christian Understandings at Georgetown University here in Washington. Her publications include Islam, Gender and Social Change, Muslims on the Americanization's Path, Christian-Muslim Encounters, and there are so many books and essays that I'm not going to mention. She is an associate editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World. Elaine Hagopian is Professor Emerita of Sociology, having retired from Simmons College in 1997. She served as Assistant Professor at Smith College before joining Simmons. She has held appointments at the American University in Beirut and at the American University in Cairo. She is the past president of the Association of Arab American University Graduates and is currently working on a new book entitled Being Ethnic, Being Unequal. Rashid Khalidi is the president of the American Committee on Jerusalem. He is also professor of the Middle Eastern History and director of the Center for International Studies at the University of Chicago. Rashid is the author of many books and studies. He's the author of British Policy Towards Syria and Palestine, 1906, 1914, Under Siege, PLO, Decision Making During the 1982 War, and Palestinian Identity, his recent book, Palestinian Identity, The Construction of National Consciousness. And I advise everybody to read that book. It's a really salient, seminal work. Okay, without any further delays, let's start with Yvonne. Yvonne?
When I started thinking about what I was going to tell you, I realized that this is a unique audience. You all know that American foreign policy in the Middle East is biased. When my students come to class, they don't know that. They think America is very fair. So I thought I could stand here and tell you what you already know, and you will give me more examples of how it is biased than I could possibly give you in 20 minutes. Now let me go over what I have to teach my students in a class on modern Middle East history. First of all, they come in, I ask them, what do you think about Arabs or Muslims? And I found out, I was teaching a class at University of Massachusetts. I had 130 students in the class. One student piped up and said terrorists. And I said, how many in the class agree with that? 100 did. And I thought, I wonder what the other 30 are thinking. And I found out the other 30 were either Arab or Muslim. That's the scary part. Now, what do I have to teach them about the Palestinian issue and American foreign policy? I have to let them know that Deir Yassin really did take place, that there was a massacre, and it was deliberate. Despite what the pro-Israeli lobbies here in the United States propagate. I have to tell them that there was a massacre in Khiyam. I had to show them Sabra and Shatila. And after I finished showing them Sabra and Shatila, one girl in the class said, "Aren't you going to show the other side?" The question is, what is the other side? That Sabra and Shatila did not take place? I had to tell them about Qana, which was distorted by deliberate policy of the United States because the United Nations report wanted to cover up what happened at Qana. But basically, these are the major points. Where do you start in order to document American policy towards the Middle East? Do you start with Truman's explanation of why he supported the state of Israel? A lot of us grew up thinking that John Foster Dulles really stood up for what America is about when he told the Israelis, the British and the French to withdraw after the conquest, during the Suez War. Now, as people are looking at his papers, we realize it wasn't out of any American sentiment. It was because he was personally peeved because he was out of the loop. It had nothing to do with what we all hope for, that one day America will wake up and realize that the policies in the Middle East are un-American. But it is American policy to be biased, and increasingly you will find diplomats who have sort of retired from the foreign policy establishment who will admit to that, and they will say that it is biased and we have a double standard. Now, of course, we have had the great example that is still active. We can all see how America deals with Iraq and how it deals with Israel. We also are fully aware that the United States rescinded Zionism is racism when Clinton was elected president, not because Israel became a paragon of virtue, not because Israel began to give equal treatment to its citizens, but because the Israeli lobby bought Clinton an election. And therefore, it was declared that it wasn't racist. We used to say that the Israeli lobby influenced American policy. And everybody accused us of believing in a conspiracy theory. Folks, we don't have to whisper about it anymore because the Israeli lobby is out of the closet. It isn't a conspiracy theory anymore, it is policy. All you have to do is live in Washington and find out who decides American foreign policy in the Middle East. We used to say that the Israeli lobby occupies Capitol Hill. It now occupies the State Department and the White House. Consequently, American foreign policy in the Middle East is not just, it is not fair, it is not right, it is not legal, and it is not good for America. And I think as citizens of the United States, it is our duty to keep talking about it. I have visiting me at the moment some relatives. We have a family reunion. And I want you to know, the last 2 days when my brother-in-law knew I was going to give a speech, he asked me, "What are you going to talk about?" And I said, "I really don't know, because everybody knows what I'm going to be talking about." He said, "You should shut up, you should be careful, you will go to jail, they will persecute you." And you know something? He reminded me, that's the way my mother raised me. Each one of us has been raised to think that we cannot speak out. But we now live in America where we are guaranteed the freedom of speech, and we better use it, because nobody is going to speak for us unless we speak for ourselves. Now I want to insist again that American foreign policy is wrong. It is not only biased, it is un-American. It is against every professed American value. Let me give you a list. Repeatedly, our elected officials tell us that Israel is a democracy. Israel is a democracy for Jews. It is not a democracy for its Christian and Muslim citizens. And I don't have to tell you that. You all know that. Israel discriminates against its citizens based on religious identification. If they are Christian or Muslim, there are different laws that deal with them. And that includes retirement pay, paycheck. It also includes whether you are killed by a terrorist. If you're a Palestinian killed by an Israeli terrorist, you cannot be compensated. But you are an Israeli killed by a Palestinian terrorist, you can be compensated. And the only difference is your religion. Because Israel is based on religious identity. It isn't based on a discrimination against Arabs. Israel took every Arab Jew it could find. It's still trying to collect them. It's not because they are Arab. It's because they are Christian and Muslim. It is not because they are Palestinian. It took every Palestinian Jew that lived in Palestine prior to 48. The real discrimination is against religion. And we have to talk about it. Currently, the United States government is theoretically going to establish an office to monitor persecution, religious persecution in the world. We must insist that they have to look at Israeli practices and its discrimination against Christians and Muslims. When Netanyahu came to the United States Congress and gave a speech, he thought, now there is freedom of religious practice. And they gave him a standing ovation. He gave that speech at the same time that the Israeli policy is to deny Christians access to their holy places in Jerusalem and to deny Muslims access to their holy places in Jerusalem. And more recently, they denied Muslims the right to go to the Hajj. Nobody in the American public knows about it, and nobody is speaking about it. And if we don't speak about it, nobody will. So we have to get involved. Israel violates the human rights of Palestinians, regardless of the Oslo Agreement, regardless of the Geneva Conventions, regardless of United Nations resolutions. It continues to defy all of them. It is a law unto itself. Recently, the president of Hartford Seminary wrote a piece on, in sort of recognition of the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the State of Israel. And she wrote something about the fact that there is a need for penance on the part of Israel for what it has done. She has been savaged. The press has been against her. There was a lot of Jewish response against her. And the thing that was most interesting to me is that one rabbi told her, Dr. Zygmunt, you don't understand. Israel to us is like Jesus to the Christians. What he was saying is that Jesus is God incarnate. And according to the Bible, you will not take the Lord your God's name in vain. And I think that given the fact that this is a land of freedom of religion, if the Jewish community of the United States decides that Israel is God that needs to be worshipped, we have to accept that. That is their God, it is fine. But we have to insist that if Israelis steal, they are thieves. If they kill, they are murderers. They are not God. Israel violates every value that we place. For example, it has a nuclear arsenal. It is not subject to any kind of disarmament treaty. It has weapons of mass destruction that it has used. It has used napalm and other anti-personnel weapons against the Palestinian people, against the Lebanese people. It has abducted hostages. Sheikh Abdul Karim Abed and Sheikh Mustafa Dirani are still in jail. They were abducted by Israelis. Any other country would have been called a rogue state. The United States government has said nothing about that. I would say that we have to help the Americans understand that Israel is the greatest threat to American interests in the Middle East. And it is our duty as Arab Americans who understand that this is a skewed policy that the American government has at the present time. It is our duty to speak up. The proof of what I'm saying is what Israel has put out as a little document about it's celebrating its 50 years of history. It says, together with pride, together in hope. And the pictures are of one native Israeli, 1 Russian Jew, and 1 Ethiopian Jew. There are no Arabs in its vision of what Israel is about, regardless of the fact that there are a number of Christians and Muslims who are citizens of the State of Israel. At the moment, we are saddled with the peace process. There are 4 partners to the peace process who are negotiating. One is the American Jewish Organizations, which is AIPAC, Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, National Jewish Coalition, and Americans for Peace Now. The other is the White House, which is National Security with Sam Berger. The third party is the State Department with Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk. Now, who would have thought that Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk are representing the Palestinians? But that's where we have come. That they are the closest thing to the aspirations of what the Palestinian people, what the Arab people want. Both of them come out of the Israeli lobby. Both of them support the State of Israel. And where are we now? We have a president of the Palestinian entity who goes around talking about himself as signing the peace of the brave. The peace of the brave. But if you look closely at what he has signed, I would say it is the peace of the slaves. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think there is something we can do about it. And I'm here to urge you to get involved. And I want you to get involved not in hosting dinners for President Clinton and giving him standing ovations. We have not arrived, regardless of what some people say in the Arab American community. If we get up and give a standing ovation to a policy that discriminates against Palestinians because they are Christian and Muslim. We have to get involved by building coalitions. And one of the ways we can build coalition is in collaborating with people who are trying to wake up the American churches to the reality of what Israel is doing. There is a group that is being helped by Betsy Barlow, and there is the ACJ, the American Committee on Jerusalem, and I got 5 minutes, okay? I won't last that long. They are trying to help the American churches to understand what the situation in the Middle East is about. We need to talk to them because they have no idea. Literally, they have no idea what is happening in the Middle East. The churches have been very influential in bringing an end to the apartheid conditions in South Africa. Once they found out what it was about, they were very active. They helped bring about the end to the Vietnam War, and they can bring an end to American foreign policy that is totally skewed against the Palestinian people. So we need to work with them, but in order to be able to work with them, we need your commitment, your time, and your financial support. And you have to support the Arab American organizations and the other organizations that are working in order to bring about a change. We cannot say, oh, I gave 5 years ago. That is not enough. We have to give and give and give until it hurts. And I'm serious about that. I'm not saying that we are not generous. We're very generous, but we do not have a history of giving for a cause. I remember the former executive secretary of ADC was telling me, he approached an Arab American and asked him for some funds to help ADC, and the person said, well, let's get over lunch and talk about it. So I took him out to lunch, spent probably $500 being generous, and at the end told him, I don't have any funds to give you. Now those $500 would have made a difference. We don't need to eat as much or spend as much as food. We have to give until it hurts. We cannot wait for somebody else to do it for us. We have to do it ourselves because we are the only people who know what is happening. We are the only people who know what the suffering over there is about, and we are the only people who have an access. We need to write to the newspapers. We need to march tomorrow, but we need to march every day. We need to announce every day that what American foreign policy is about is wrong. We need to telephone and to write and write and write. I know everybody wants their son to be an engineer and a doctor. We need some journalists. We need some fiction writers. Please allow your children to choose to be part of America and help transform America. One of the greatest things that happened this spring is what the students at Georgetown, Arab students at Georgetown, were able to do. And they stood their ground, and they told the story as it is, and we had a lot of flack from all over the place. Even the president and the dean called people in and harassed them and said, how could you do that? We're going to lose our donors. But basically, those students stood their ground, and they told our story. Will you stand up and tell our story? Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. You're a great troublemaker. Elaine, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Yvonne is a hard act to follow, and Rashid is a hard act to precede. So I don't know, I'll probably be the salami in the sandwich. In any case, after hearing this morning's panel and after hearing Yvonne and so forth, I have actually 3 different speeches I can give, and I'm going to maybe just throw away most of my notes and just talk to you about some recent developments. But first, I would like to just point out a couple of things that I've learned from the Black experience. I've been working a great deal with our African American brothers and sisters, and I have learned a great deal from their experience. I think all of us know what the basic American interests are in the Middle East: oil, investments, and control stability, make sure things are stable or at least tolerably unstable, and in essence to have American hegemony in the strategic Middle East. So we all know that. And we all know that from its inception, the United States favored Israel. I think we all know that as a partner. It was really after the '67 war that the Pentagon really took notice of Israel when they got rid of NASA for the U.S., or Nasserism. And from that point on, Israel has become what one author has called the kind of political contraceptive against Arab popular movements or instability. And I would like to just say here that while I think it's very important and we should all organize and we have to confront American foreign policy, et cetera, I think it's very important to recognize that American foreign policy is not going to basically change until we do a couple of things ourselves. Now, number one, I think we should organize as much as we can. I think we should at least organize to minimize the kinds of legislation and policies that our government has. But until the second thing happens, and that is until the Arabs themselves, and particularly the Palestinians, have a credible strategy and vision, one that appears humanitarian and also one that can gain the acceptance of the world, and particularly in Europe, they're not going to pay attention to us. Nobody's going to pay attention to us. And besides which, as you all know, when you go to see government people, what they basically say to you is that, well, the Palestinians have accepted this. You've always said the PLO was their representative. Arafat signed this. I mean, they're not asking for anything other than the implementation of Oslo, whereas most of us in this room, at least I hope so, have always been against Oslo, because from its very beginning, its terms were ridiculous. So, having said that, I would like to just quickly point out something from the black experience. I would like to get into more depth in that, but I won't, because I want to tell you about something new that is in fact happening, that is a little ray of hope. And it is not because I'm involved in it. Most of you know me, I'm an organizer. I'm a facilitator. I'm not an idea person. I don't have the right to try to define how people should behave or what vision they should have. I am simply a facilitator for others to come together and have ideas. If I nudge them in a particular direction, well, they don't know it because I use certain techniques. But anyway, there are two kinds of approaches within the black community, and we can learn from them in solving their problem in the United States. And of course, the United States is a different society than dealing with Israel. But one was the approach towards self-development first. That is, self-development, build your resources, build your personnel, and then come out and confront the society as a group. Some people think Booker T. Washington was the one who initiated this. He really wasn't. I mean, he had the notion of just development, don't worry about civil rights, but not the real sense of a community bonding with a real strategy where you know who you are, you have your vision, and you're able from a position of strength to confront the society and hold up a mirror and say, we are what you produced, and now you have an image of yourself that's different, but this is who we are, and now we want to change that, and we're going to help you to become a better society. It's the self-development approach. What that self-development approach involves, in which blacks have not fully developed, but better certainly than Palestinians, is three things. One is a cultural vision. Now, Edward Said has been arguing for a vision for years. And it's not just to say democratic secular state or not just to say this or that. It is a vision that has some concrete ideas about coexistence, about how to live together. So you need that. And the PLO, with all of its slogans, in essence, never had that. Never had that. It never really took up the Palestinian identity. And by the way, if you haven't read Rashid's new book, you should, on Palestinian identity and its history. But it never took up the notion of identity in the sense of now, who are we for the future? Who are we in this new situation? How do we build a vision that is credible to the world out there? That's number one. Number two, you have to have your own economic base, no matter how humble it is. And the economic base that was built in the Intifada was a wonderful example. It was not sustained. But why do you have it? Because then you control your own destiny. What happened with the PLO is they took money from the Arab regime, even though they said they wanted to go it alone. They were always tied to the Arab regimes. And therefore, when the Arab regimes wanted to pull money out, they were not able to sustain a political program. So if you have vision and you have means, no matter how humble, and you demand sacrifice from your people as they have in all other third world nations, then you can have a sustained political strategy, a sustained political program. You can gain friends. You have a credible vision. You have something that is humanitarian. You have something that also has to realistically take into consideration interests in the area, but not in an exploitive way, but one that accommodates and yet at the same time allows you the right to control your own destiny. The blacks never fully developed this. The Nation of Islam says it tries to develop this. It's not really the answer either, but I won't go into that. They focused on the second alternative, which was mostly the NAACP. And the NAACP used to just talk about civil rights. And civil rights means that you simply get your rights under the Constitution. But in fact, if you start from a position where you suffered racism and you're down and under, you may, under certain times of pressures and civil rights movements, you may get certain rights. And we know that the black middle class has certainly increased. But the black community, as a black community, is still at the bottom of the heap. And all statistics show that, whether it's unemployment, education, whatever you want. And the civil rights movement, interestingly enough, followed in some ways the NAACP approach, which was sort of integration. Now, the problem with that was that in the NAACP, they followed the advice of a lot of friends. And most people don't realize that, in fact, it was a Jewish American civil libertarian who was the first head of the NAACP. And unlike the Jewish community, which focused on developing themselves as a community, bonded, and then demanding their rights and being able to sustain themselves with their own economic system and support system, they focused for blacks on civil rights, which meant not so much bonding, but individual rights. Now, what I would like to point out is that what the Palestinians need is a kind of self-development. This is not to isolate yourself. This is not to say, I don't want any friends. This is first to get your own act together, and with any friends that are willing to participate in that vision, and then you're able to get adherence to that position, and you're able to come out and say, we believe in this, we believe in that, this is what we want to do, and you can plan a political strategy, and it is long-term. Now, let me tell you what we're trying to do. I have a paper that eventually will be published on comparison with the black community and South Africa, not just simply in terms of apartheid, but the differences between South Africa and the Palestinian question. Everybody thinks that if you can just expose the apartheid system in Palestine, that somehow people will wake up. Well, they will, but it still won't change much because South Africa is really quite different from Palestine. The world did not favor a minority Afrikaner state. They did favor a Jewish state, and they still favor a Jewish state. They have also said they would like a Palestinian state, but they're not that committed to effecting it. So let me tell you a little bit about something, and there are a couple of people in the audience who participate in this, and maybe they could also respond to it. About a year and a half ago, a number of us in the Boston area sort of got together, and as I told you, I'm a facilitator, and simply said, things have gotten so bad, and what is it that the overseas community can do? We cannot tell people there what to do. It is not right for us to tell people there what to do. But we can provide a venue in which people from the area can come together, those who were really desperate and in despair, to come together and to begin to share ideas and also to benefit from whatever ideas we first reflected on. We spent a year doing workshops and reflecting. And one workshop we had Dr. Hader Abdeshafi and Leila Zakaria and a few other people from the ground. And from these reflections which we put together, and I'll tell you some of the participants in that workshop before we went off overseas, Nasir Aruri and Lemi Sandoni and Sarah Roy and Sohair Morsi and Ashraf Bayoumi and Nadim Rouhana, who is a Palestinian from the 48, a friend of Azmi's, and so forth. And so we had some ideas, tentative, about what it is that we can do, what it is that we should be trying to help and facilitate. We planned a meeting which we held in Sicily. The meeting in Sicily was held at a wonderful facility that was offered to us by Dr. Sharif Basyouni. And we invited people who, for the most part, are not known. There are a few that were known that somebody insisted on inviting because somehow they had credibility or clout or something. If I had my druthers, I would not have invited them. But mostly there were people who work on the ground, very different from previous ideas. And there were people who came from Egypt who were fighting normalization with Israel. Very, very important. A very strong committee, a very strong effort in Egypt exists to fight normalization until such time as Israel stops being a Zionist racist state. And these people are very important. Maybe Arab nationalism is dead, but Arabness is not dead. I can assure you of that. People came from Jordan, they came from Lebanon, they came from all parts of Palestine. Let me just quickly tell you what some of the discussion was. These were not academic papers that were given, by the way. It was a workshop for 5 days in which people talked. And in the talking, the three communities of Palestinians, those from 48, those under occupation, and those in the diaspora, they discovered that they really don't know an awful lot about each other. That in some ways, each came with their own idea of what needed to be done related to their immediate problem. I'll tell you just some of the ideas that they had, but there were so many variations, so please don't take them too literally. The 48 group came with the notion of a binational state, which I personally, but it's none of my business, favor. Not a Lebanon, please not a Lebanon, but a secular democratic state in which the rights of both communities are recognized. That seems sort of way in the distance now, but I'll tell you why many people came to favor that. The people under occupation came with still thinking maybe a two-state solution. Some even came with the idea of federation with Jordan and Israel, mostly to relieve the incarceration by having a larger area in which to move about. They understood it would not mean sovereignty. I have 5 minutes, okay? And the people who came from the diaspora varied from, we want our right to return, but we know that under present conditions we're not going to get it. Therefore, some of them opted for the notion of still fighting for a two-state solution, primarily because they wanted a passport. They knew they may not be able to go back, but whatever the state was, the fictitious state, the mythical state, the make-believe state, if it could give them a passport so they could move more easily in the world, that would have been something successful. Others in the diaspora still were thinking of strategies for return, etc. The fascinating thing was that many of them had not understood the impact of normalization that had gone ahead with many Arab countries on themselves. They hadn't thought about it very much. I will not be talking out of line when I say that Atif Kubarsi presented an excellent paper on globalization and the impact on the Arab world. He gave us his ideas on that, and his paper was not read. It was just collected by the group, and he commented on this. The Egyptians talked about their efforts to block normalization, and the idea was that somehow those efforts needed to be articulated. Now, where are we? We've come back. Some of the people went back and are sustaining this interest. Some of them went back to old habits, old structures and so forth and so on. What we are determined to do, and we are a small group, and we hope others will join us when it becomes something, is to try to continue to hold workshops. It was very difficult, by the way, to raise money for that. And I'm very cheap, and I managed everything so that people had really bare bones stuff, and they had to buy their own food, and some people didn't have money for that. It was really difficult, but anyway, we did it. We want to try to have more workshops, but also we are now organizing among the few people here from a nucleus to develop a study pattern that is a specific kind of focus. One, we already have funding for a baseline study on the Palestinian condition, i.e. a real history of the Palestinians, what happened to them, the strategies, what failed, why didn't they work. And that is aimed at recreating the Palestinian nation, bringing together the three segments, the diaspora, the occupied people, and those in Israel, bringing them together to recreate the nation and have one strategy. They have to decide what it is. They have to decide what the vision is. They have to build the economy, whatever it is. They have to find ways like they did in the Intifada. And another study that we will do when we get the funding is a detailed study of Israeli society, one that will look very closely at the segments within Israeli society, how they might reconfigure, political biographies, and to keep this updated each year. Another will be to do feasibility studies for optional solutions to the Palestinian question. If you're still thinking about a two-state solution, what kind of vision do you have? How would it look? What would you do about the diaspora? What would you do about the 48 Palestinians who now totally realize they are not going to get equality ever in a Zionist Israel? And they are anxious to rejoin the Palestinian people. Another kind of, and we will have lawyers and psychologists and sociologists, et cetera, working on this. There's a very excellent book by Nadim Rouhana on Palestinian identity in a Jewish state. It's very much worth reading. It's published by Yale University. So these are some of the things we're doing, and we're trying to find the ways in which those who are blocking normalization, when they hold some sort of a conference or they hold some sort of a demonstration, that they get word to others who will hold a quiet demonstration so that it shows that there is some effort within the Arab world that Arabness is not dead. Maybe Arab nationalism between the regimes may be latent. I always like to say that in front of Clovis. But there is something, as one person put it, and I'll close with this, Najla Khouri, who works with the Palestinians in camps and also Lebanese, she is Lebanese. Najla came, this is Yas Khouri's wife, and she said, you know, I always knew that we were one Arab people. She said, but I've been sitting here taking so many notes, and she said, you know, all these people from here, there, and everywhere, you know, we really are one people. We really have the same concerns. And it is based on the fact that you have a nucleus, and if you have long-term thinking, and you can really, really think about a vision, that's important. My final statement is, and I will say my own bias, the area that we know as Palestine, all of Palestine, is already a binational state. One people dominate and are democratic among themselves. The other people are oppressed. I am not suggesting, and I don't think anyone who was at this conference is suggesting, that the territories be annexed by Israel and that people then just fight their way to get some little thing like the Palestinians and Israel now. That's the NAACP approach. What we are saying is, you get your act together, all of you from the three communities. You build a vision, you support each other, you rededicate yourself, you have a long-term educational program, and you go into the camps and villages and address the people and involve them in their lives. And it's no longer solutions from the top. It's no longer the solutions of the politicos or even the intellectuals. It is the solutions that must come from the people. We are the facilitators to bring this to them, and we hope that they will get the act together, and maybe not in my lifetime, but sometime if that road is starting now, and we get there, there will always be the hope of regaining Palestine for Arabs and Jews in coexistence and a democratic secular state. Thank you.
Thank you, Hisham. When I agreed to Hala's request to come and speak, I didn't know that there would be a Bulls finals game last night, or that my son would have baseball games yesterday and this morning. So I didn't realize how big a sacrifice I would be making. And then I said to myself, well, these are all Arab Americans. They're all integrated into this society. They will understand how big that sacrifice is, and so it's worth it. The fact that only half of you laughed when I said that is part of our problem. You should all have laughed. I'm also wishing the World Cup, so now the rest of you should be laughing. I'm going to talk about something which should not make you laugh, though. I'm going to talk about some elements of the bias in U.S. policy, and I'm going to talk about whether that policy can be changed. And that's the main burden of what I want to talk about. I think you're all familiar with two main opposing views on the subject of U.S. policy in the Middle East. One view would have it that American policy is founded on deep-rooted, long-term interests, control of oil, strategic access, support of Israel as a regional policeman, and that these interests are essentially inimical to the peoples of the Middle East, and that this policy is immutable, unchangeable. This is what I call the vision of U.S. policy as unchanging and imperialist. Another view would have it that U.S. policy in the Middle East is like all U.S. foreign policy. It is subject to conflicting pressures, which include powerful domestic pressures as well as long-term U.S. interests. Now, I'm going to suggest, as the basis for what I want to say about whether this policy can be changed, that the reality, in fact, lies somewhere between these two views. Clearly, there are long-term strategic interests which drive U.S. policy. However, these interests are considerably more complex than the simplistic view as the U.S. as an imperial power would have it, and there are all kinds of ways of furthering those interests. If you have an interest, it doesn't determine how you go about securing it. For example, the U.S. interest in oil is not just related to access to oil, the price of oil, or the stability of the oil-producing regimes. It's also related to guaranteeing that a major share of oil revenues are spent in the United States. Now, this does not mean that it is a vital and unchanging U.S. national interest that a large proportion of these oil revenues must be spent on useless, expensive weapon systems, which Middle Eastern countries will never be able to use, although that is the current situation. These revenues could just as easily be spent on infrastructural investment, which would benefit the peoples of the region, and from which U.S. companies could also benefit. That is an example of how an interest could be secured in a variety of different ways. And I would point out how this works itself out depends on decisions made in Riyadh and Doha and Cairo and in other capitals in the Middle East, not in Washington or Houston or Chicago. Moreover, the U.S. interest in Israel as a regional policeman is not an immutable interest. It is a conjunctural interest. It was not a factor at all before 1967. Israel was not perceived by any American statesman, policymaker, defense official as a regional policeman or as a tool of U.S. interests. From 1967 until the end of the Cold War, it was. But you may have noticed that it has declined measurably in importance as such a regional policeman since the end of the Cold War, and the best evidence of that is that Israel was pushed unceremoniously to the sidelines by the United States when it made war on Iraq in 1991. So, there are vital U.S. interests, but these interests change, and they can be affected by regional factors and by domestic factors in this country as well. And I think here is where this vision of U.S. policy as unchanging has flaws. It fails utterly to take into account the changing blend of domestic factors or the changing nature of U.S. interests. Now, I'm going to get to the domestic factors in a moment. I want to focus more on the changing nature of U.S. interests. For example, for decades, peace in the Middle East was not treated as a major U.S. interest, notwithstanding all the windy rhetoric about peace, the peace process, and how much the United States has done to further it. Peace in the Middle East was not treated as a major U.S. interest. The U.S. primarily sought strategic advantage at the expense of the Soviet Union. That was the objective for 40 or 30 years. When doing so coincided with efforts towards a peaceful settlement, the United States backed those efforts or sponsored those efforts. When it did not, the U.S. was the first power to sabotage efforts by the United Nations or the Soviet Union or European powers or others to achieve peace, which efforts would have limited U.S. regional advantage and hindered the United States in its competition with the Soviet Union. And you may recall that in spite of that record of not having any particular commitment to peace or to a peace settlement per se, for several years at the end of the Cold War, during the Bush administration, a regional peace settlement did become a major U.S. interest. This change took place for very simple reasons. I could explain them if you're interested. They related to U.S. international objectives at the time. They related to U.S. regional aims at the time, and they related also to U.S. domestic politics. So here's an example of a way in which American policy has changed significantly and fundamentally. It's changed again when the Clinton administration came into office. This administration ceased to treat Middle East peace as a major U.S. interest. In fact, I think there can be little question that this administration currently accords peace in the Middle East little or no importance. This change, again, occurred for reasons that are easy to explain. These were largely domestic reasons, and they also had to do with the fact that the Clinton administration's foreign policy generally is largely determined by domestic politics. It generally lacks direction, and it generally lacks clear objectives or a principled underpinning. We could see this in American relations with China, American relations with Russia, American relations with a number of other regions. It's not just in the Middle East that American policy lacks all of these things under Clinton. So it is no surprise that here too, because of domestic considerations primarily, there has been a major change in U.S. policy. My point is that in the 70s and most of the 80s, it was largely strategic interests which dictated one approach to peace in the Middle East, essentially excluding the Soviet Union. During the Bush administration, different strategic reasons, different strategic interests dictated an entirely different approach. And finally, under this administration, it has been mainly domestic interests which have determined yet a different approach. And I think this brings me to where I want to focus mainly today, and this is the impact of domestic politics on U.S. foreign policy. I think that when we talk about American foreign policy, we should keep two things in mind. The first is that Americans like to think that there is a moral underpinning to what their country does in the world. Since the United States became a world power under Wilson, and again under Roosevelt, this has always been central to the American vision of what it does in the world. We may not believe that American policy has been moral in the Middle East. I do not believe that it has been. But Americans have to believe, if they're to support a foreign policy, that it has a moral underpinning. They're very different in that from many other people in many other parts of the world for whom a moral underpinning is irrelevant to their country's foreign policy. Americans must believe this, or they will not support a foreign policy. So if you want to sell something to them, as the Zionist lobby has sold American policy in the Middle East to the American public, you have to make them believe that what their country is doing is moral. The second thing to keep in mind about American foreign policy is that it is largely determined by domestic considerations almost all the time. There are many other things that go into it, but domestic considerations are always extremely important. And these are often quite mundane. Indeed, these are sometimes appallingly crass interests. They are the kind of things that move domestic politics in Chicago. Money, votes, corruption, bribery, influence peddling, backdoor deals. The kind of things that Cook County, the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, the politics on the local level work through and because of. The kind of you scratch my back and I scratch yours kind of chosh-bosh type of dealing, which when it's talked about in the Middle East is considered revolting and degrading and third world corruption, is actually what oils American politics. If you don't know this, you're not living in the United States. We have an international terminal. We have an international terminal in Chicago, which cost several $100 million to build. It took 6 years to build. There are probably 20 contractors in this room who could have delivered that building in 1 year for $150 million. The city of Chicago. That's the way American politics works. And that is how American foreign policy is in very large measure driven, by the same kinds of domestic considerations. I think that an understanding of these realities has to inform our efforts to change American Middle East policy. I think we have to understand that if we're going to change it first, we have to seize the high moral ground. We have to understand that this is an absolute prerequisite if we are going to influence and change American Middle East policy. And I don't think, frankly, that that should be very hard if we stress the kinds of points that were stressed this morning: self-determination, an end to occupation, human rights, rather than trying to defend regimes and leaders and policies in the Middle East which are indefensible and many of which are unspeakable. Now, it is not a secret, I think, to any of you, but it's something we should always keep in mind, that the Zionist movement has succeeded, going back to World War I, in occupying that high moral ground virtually unopposed in this country. It did this first by picturing Zionism as an innocent rescue project for oppressed European Jews, obscuring, of course, what it was doing to the Palestinians. It then did this by successfully linking Israel to the Holocaust in the American and the Western imagination. And finally, it did this by picturing Israel as a tiny, beleaguered democratic island in a sea of Arab and Muslim fanatics. None of these images should be unfamiliar to you. The point is, as Yvonne pointed out, that is what most Americans still believe. And as Azmi said this morning, that is what the celebrations of Israel's 50th anniversary were dedicated to reinforcing in the American and the Western mind, these images. Using these themes, it has managed to cling to this high moral ground in spite of serious reverses, firstly during the invasion of Lebanon, and second in 1982, and secondly during the Intifada. Now, I don't think it's very hard for any of us to figure out how one has to deal with these issues. Very simply, the falsehoods have to be exposed. Most of what Israel says about itself is false, manifestly false, and those falsehoods have to be exposed. Secondly, we have to confront the issue of the Holocaust, which I think Arabs and Arab Americans have never done seriously. An indication of how unseriously people in the Arab world are confronting it has been the ridiculous reception that has been accorded to some ideas which are not really worthy of serious consideration about the Holocaust. What we have to do is to make it clear that this was a horrible evil, but that the evil done to one people does not justify their doing evil to others. And that the victims of the greatest crime in the 20th century can victimize others. Those are very simple ideas. They're not that hard to get across. And we have to confront them in just those terms. Finally, we have to stress issues that are morally clear. Occupation is unacceptable. The kind of repression of rights which Israel perpetuates all over the Middle East is unacceptable. And that self-determination is a right of all peoples, and human rights are rights of all peoples. Only by hammering away at these themes, I think, will it be possible to convince Americans that blind and unquestioning support of Israel is incompatible of their image of their own foreign policy as morally based. This is essential, and I think that is something that we as Arab Americans have never fully realized or addressed systematically. Now, I want to talk a little more about the issues involved in American domestic politics. We all know how AIPAC works, I think. I think we all know that what they do simply is to maximize the use of methods which every successful lobby in this city, from the NRA to the National Abortion Rights League to every other lobby in Washington uses. They've used these things to maximum effect, and they've used them to affect not only Congress now, but the executive. Now, I'm not suggesting that Arab Americans have the capabilities which the American Jewish community does today. We can't raise the kinds of money that Israel raises annually in this country. They raised about $1 billion in the United States this year. They raised $60 million in Chicago, which has a Jewish community of only 250,000 people. They raised $40 million in LA, which has 750,000 people, and they raised $120 million in New York, which has a huge Jewish community. The point is that those three Jewish communities of differing sizes gave very differing amounts of money per capita. Much, much more, I'm sure, than Arab Americans give per capita. We don't have those capabilities. And we don't have Arab Americans in positions like Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East, Presidential Advisor for National Security Affairs, Presidential Envoy for the Arab-Israeli peace negotiations, or Ambassador to Egypt. We know that we don't have Arab Americans in those jobs, and we know who are in those jobs. Nevertheless, it was not always this way. And I think we should remember this. During my lifetime, which is to say only 50 years ago, a majority of US Jews had not yet been won over to Zionism. There were deep divisions in the American Jewish community in the 30s and the 40s over the issue of Zionism. Going back a decade more to the late 1930s, in the moment which was the greatest crisis in the history of Judaism, perhaps, certainly the greatest crisis in 2 millennia of Jewish history, the same American Jewish community which we today see as a colossus was completely incapable of changing US policy in terms of helping European Jewry, in terms of opposing Hitler, or even in terms of changing US immigration law. They could not do any of those things 60 years ago. None of them. They were completely impotent. Why was that? It was because they were divided. It was because they were insecure. It was because basically they were a first and second generation immigrant community, just like Arab Americans are today. So only 50 years ago, only 50 or 60 years ago, they were in the kind of position of total impotence in the moment of greatest crisis in their history, which most of us, I think, sometimes feel we are in.
Why do I say all of this? I say it because it shows there is nothing eternal or inevitable about the power of the Israeli lobby. And because I think what they have done in a half century, we could do in considerably less time than that. I think that the present conjuncture is a particularly favorable one. Foreign aid is unpopular, and foreign aid is aid to Israel, basically. That's why that bill goes through Congress. That's the only reason there is a foreign aid bill, in fact, if you look at it carefully. Israel's nuclear arsenal is, if exposed and talked about, would make Israel very vulnerable politically in this country, particularly after what has happened with India and Pakistan. The Armenian and the Greek lobbies, who are two of the allies upon which AIPAC has depended for much of its success, are profoundly alienated from Israel and from AIPAC because of the Israeli-Turkish alliance. Profoundly alienated, probably permanently alienated. Finally, American Jews have more doubts about Israel's policies than at any time in the past, and Arab Americans and Muslim Americans are beginning to involve themselves on a grassroots level in American society and politics to a greater extent than ever before. Now, I think that we have to do this, all of these things, and we have to do more. We have to analyze what U.S. interests are. We have to analyze which of them, in fact, are compatible with our objectives as a community and which have to be seen in completely different light. I think that we have to focus on democracy. We have to focus on human rights. We have to focus on things which the American people really do support. And whether the Clinton administration or the administration after it pays attention or not to these are things which the American people will support. These are things which ultimately Congress will support. I think that they are absolutely necessary if we are to argue for a moral basis to U.S. policy and to show that there's a profound contradiction between everything Israel does and what Americans believe. Now, the mechanics of doing this, you know. Local grassroots action, a belief that it is possible to affect the workings of the American political system, and a degree of clarity of vision and a degree of unity of effort. If we achieve these things, and if we articulate a platform which Arab Americans and their potential allies in this society can support, there is no reason whatsoever that American policy in the Middle East cannot be changed from support for occupation and support for human rights abuses to opposition to occupation and opposition to human rights abuses. There's no reason it cannot be changed from opposing Palestinian self-determination to supporting it, and there's no reason that it cannot be changed from collusion with Israel's sabotage of any possibility of peace to working for a real peace, because the American people, of course, do want peace in the Middle East. It is entirely up to us to do these things, and I think they can be done within this generation. But to do them, it is essential that we accept that however hostile America has been to our part of the world, those policies are not immutable. Those policies have changed in the past. Those policies can be changed in the future. But we have to abandon the crutch of this belief that this policy is based on interests which never change or is driven by a lobby which cannot be challenged. That lobby was built up by ordinary men and women within a generation and a half. There was no AIPAC 25 years ago. It didn't even exist. There is no reason, absolutely no reason on earth that we cannot do something similar over the same time period. With one difference. Our goals include peace and security for all the peoples in the Middle East and not a privileged place of hegemony for one people. And the policy that we want for this country is one which respects the rights of all the peoples of the Middle East and doesn't further the rights of some at the expense of the others. These are noble goals. These are goals the American people would support if we could articulate them loudly and clearly. I suggest we dedicate ourselves to making that effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rashid. Although I think that you were very harsh on Chicago politics, and and rightly so, but for a blues fanatic like me, someone who admires Chicago blues, you're not going to diminish the importance of that city for me. Okay, thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Rashid. I think you would agree with me that we've heard three highly critical, three highly original, and three highly provocative presentations from our panelists. And now for the fun part, we have microphones on both sides here. Please, if you have a comment, make sure that your comment is precise, short, because being laconic is a virtue, believe me.
And please speak loudly into the microphones. I did not hear one question in the morning session.
The acoustics are terrible in this room. I'll try to repeat the questions. And if you have a question, also make it short and make sure that at the end of it there is a question mark. And we will take 2 questions from this side, 2 questions from this side, and then we'll ask our panelists to dwell on them. Go ahead, please.
My name is Betsy Barlow. I'm the coordinator for Friends of Sabile in North America. This is an organization which is trying to change the attitudes of American Christians on this issue. I thank Yvonne for mentioning the organization, or mentioning my name, but really it's the organization that needs to be named. I would like to meet with anybody who's interested in working to change the opinion of American Christians. We have a photo exhibit which is traveling. A few pictures of this exhibit are up from time to time in room EF. It's not up right now, but I hope it will be up later. And we do have a flyer about the photo exhibit, so you could have that at your church, at your city hall, at your library, and it's been up in some places. It helps to tell the Palestinian story and change people's minds. We also have a calendar, commemorative calendar, which also helps. We have lectures, we have tours that are going overseas, we have conferences both there and here, and I'd be glad to tell you about that, but I don't want to take more time now. So if anybody wants to talk to me about this organization, I'll be here for a few minutes after the session.
Okay,
thank you.
My name is Wafa Salman, and I am the founder and president of the Institute of Near Eastern and African Studies in Cambridge. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Okay.
Hi.
I'm going to repeat. My name is Wafa Salman. I'm the founder and president of the Institute of Near Eastern and African Studies in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now there is a noise, I guess.
Stay away from it, but
Okay.
higher volume.
Here we go. I would like to thank Dr. Rashid Khalidi for speaking following the title of our panel, because it is 50 years of biased foreign policy. And I think Dr. Khalidi was the only one that really talked about it in details. Concerning Dr. Yvonne, I would like to bring to your attention that Israeli discrimination is not just based on religion, is against the Sephardic Jews, the Arab Jews, the Middle Eastern Jews, and will be great for ADC every now and then to embrace the Arab Jews and hear their experience and what kind of hellish discrimination they also go through. The democracy and freedom of speech that you brought up about the United States is non-existing. I'm sorry to tell you that. And the question I have for you all is, when will we speak as Arabs about our tragedies, about the foreign policy of the United States towards Arabs, rather than American Arabs? Because it seems that we always fade away from this. And one last thing.
Quick.
Very quick. One disagreement with you, Dr. Rashid Khalidi, is that Israelis are not franchised now, or quote-unquote united. They are not. The money made them make whatever they can do, but they're still disunited. Thank you all.
Thank you.
The question is to Yvonne, to Dr. Yvonne and to Dr. Elaine.
Please go ahead.
Okay, I'm Nancy Cobain from Lexington, Virginia.
We can't hear you.
Okay, all right. I want to also mention that it's very important to this point that the Zionist influence now, both in the White House and in this Department of State, that we really didn't have before, but this policy that has come from it, that has been more pro-Israeli in the whole Middle East area, has really antagonized other parts of the American community, because it has hurt their interests over in the Middle East. Specifically, the sanctions policy has hurt American business interests in the Middle East, and a lot of American businesses are very upset about it, and they have been putting pressure on the U.S. government. And some of these countries, particularly like our sanctions policy toward Iran, has hurt American oil companies and other companies trying to open up Central Asia. These things, I think, and can help the American Arab community in Palestine, actually, because these are also unhappy parts of the American community that could they provide money too.
Okay, thank you.
This is basically a question seeking advice from Professor Khalidi and the others. Thanks for bringing up the moral issues and how we can take the moral high ground. But tell us how we do it. I may not be the only one in this room who has problems when Americans who are open-minded ask us questions about the regimes that are controlling our area, the human rights violations, the other things, how we treat the Arab Jews, for example, as the other person brought up. Help me build an argument on that issue while I'm taking a moral argument.
Okay, do I need to summarize? We have American Christians, we have discrimination in Israel, more complex, we have American business and their role, and we have how to improve or translate our moral concerns. Yvonne? Take it away.
Okay. I'm surprised that you think that the Sephardic Jews or the Arab Jews are discriminated against as much as Arab Christians and Muslim Arabs. The reason I'm saying that is that Arab Jews have been recruited from Iraq. Remember, the Israelis used to bomb synagogues in Baghdad in order to get the Iraqi Jews to move to Israel. Arab Jews, no, but listen, Arab Jews have the right to become citizens. They have the right to buy a home. Arab Christians, Arab Muslims are not allowed to buy land. They have the right to be... Arab Jews can serve in the army, they can get a retirement pay. Arab Christians, Arab Muslims can't. You cannot convince me that the state of Israel does not enshrine in its laws anti-Christian, anti-Muslim. It couches it as Arab and Palestinian, but it is definitely discrimination against Christians and Muslims. And it tries to have a Jewish state. So I'm very surprised at the question. The other thing is that, that freedom of speech is non-existent in this country. It is hard to get ourselves heard, but we can continue to speak out. I'm the one who has been censored all over the place. I get invited someplace, people will not invite me again because I will speak up. But I will continue to speak up. I've been threatened. People said they will kill my children, but I will continue to speak up, and I still speak up. No, listen.
If you had your chance. Listen.
I want you.
You had your chance, please. You can argue with her afterwards, okay? Yvonne, come on, yalla, continue.
Just one more thing. I am able...
Please.
Grow up.
It's all right. You can argue with her. You can discuss anything with her. You had your chance, please. There's a row behind you there, okay? Some authoritarianism is good sometimes. Elaine, go ahead.
I'm not sure what she's asking me.
Okay, if she doesn't... you don't have to.
I'm not sure if you're asking me to comment on the same things
Do you have anything to
Yvonne,
add?
let me just say this. First of all, I agree with Yvonne. The Mizrahi, I'm sorry? Louder? Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, stay away from it, but louder.
All right.
Elaine.
The Mizrahi, as they're called, the Mizrahim, the Oriental Jews, or what are really Arab Jews, and Ethiopian Jews and so forth, they do meet with discrimination, but it remains, as Yvonne has said. They are Jews. They make up a majority of the Jewish population in Israel. Israel cannot afford to totally alienate them. The Likud party has paid more attention to them than not. But they do have a movement in Israel, and it's called, interestingly enough, the Democratic Rainbow Coalition. And some of the issues relate very much to education and the right to housing. Some of the housing that they were leasing is now getting privatized, and they're afraid of being pushed out. So they are organizing, and the interesting thing is that they are also beginning to reach out to the Arab Palestinians in Israel And eventually, they, at least according to their literature, they understand that they have to deal with the Palestinian question in general. So there is both this feeling that, yes, they are privileged, and if you talk to a lot of them, I mean, aside from this movement, the majority of them still very much are very hostile to Arabs. They are very hostile to Arabs. As a matter of fact, they're the most right-wing group. And so while we take heart from the little movement that's happening, they are still Jews, they are still privileged, and they prefer to fight for their rights in Israel, even though there is this little movement towards a more democratic society.
Thanks, Elaine. Rashid?
To answer the questioner here who said, how does one translate what I said about taking the high moral ground? In answer to what the questioner here said about how one takes the high moral ground, that I suggest, how one turns that into a practical argument, what I would suggest is this. When one talks about human rights and democracy, and how Israel impedes human rights and democracy, one also has to talk about what the United States does and doesn't do vis-a-vis human rights and democracy in the Middle East. Many major Middle Eastern regimes are violators of human rights and are not democratic. The United States, by and large, supports those regimes. Nothing could be simpler than to say, when secret policemen in prisons used by the Israelis formerly torture Palestinians, they do so with the assistance of the Shabak and the CIA. Those are our tax dollars being used to torture Palestinians. When Egyptian policemen do the same thing, they are doing it with the assistance of US tax dollars. And so on and so forth. Yes, there are other regimes which the United States does not actually collaborate with on an intelligence level, which are also gross human rights violators in the Middle East, including Iran, including Syria, including Iraq. Nevertheless, those are not regimes that we should talk about with any pride. We are Arab Americans. Somebody said we have to talk as Arabs. If you talk as Arabs to Americans, you're talking as foreigners. Do not talk as Arabs to Americans. If you're an Arab and you're an Arab citizen and you want to talk to them, you're free to do so. My point is, you will have no effect if you position yourself as, you have to speak as an American to other Americans. Otherwise, you shouldn't be speaking. Otherwise, you're interfering in the internal affairs of the United States, and it's none of your business. Otherwise, you're behaving like Israelis are behaving, which is to say, dictating policy as foreigners to Americans. Only Americans should be telling other Americans how we as Americans should make our foreign policy. And in those circumstances, it is perfectly possible to say, we find American support for regimes like the regime of Turkey, like the regime of Israel, like the regime of this, like reprehensible. This should not happen. And the United States has never supported democracy in the Middle East. It should support democracy in the Middle East. Those are very simple, very easy things to say. And if you say that, you're talking about something which people can understand. And you're talking about something which puts Israel on a level with the worst impulses in American foreign policy and turns it from being the tiny little victim in a sea of Arab fanatics into an oppressor, which of course it is, and the right-hand man of the worst impulses in American foreign policy in the region. Shouldn't be very hard to say that. Most people, if you say that and link it to issues like foreign aid, to which most Americans are not sympathetic, even though it's a very small amount of money in terms of the bloated budget that our legislators take out of our tax dollars, will be sympathetic. So I've actually never had trouble with any of these arguments myself, with ordinary American audiences.
Thank you, Rashid. Take one question from this side.
Hello, my name is Ibrahim Alouche, and I have a question to Dr. Rashid about the issue of whether foreign policy in the United States is changeable or not. Many people who have tried to explain things to Americans about what's going on in the Middle East, especially regarding, for example, the death of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, find that people know and do not care in many cases that other people in the third world of different color, different culture, different religion are dying. What I'm saying is, maybe what is being ignored here is the question of racism in American foreign policy. That was not addressed, meaning the people who wiped out the American Indians, who enslaved the blacks, dropped the bomb in Japan, and killed 2-something million Vietnamese, maybe they do not care. In some cases, I'm not generalizing, but in many cases, there's an element of racism involved based on cultural and racial differences. I wish Dr. Khaldi would address that.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a question from this side.
Hi, my name's Thor Jacobs from Cincinnati. Rashid, I'd like to, if you could expand upon your points regarding the lack of democracy in the Middle East and the lack of U.S. support for democracy in the Middle East, and wondering if that lack of support or pressure that certainly happened in Latin America and other places, I'm wondering if that is sort of a pillar of Zionist strategy. Is it intentional to keep the Arabs in this dictatorial state of affairs so that the economies and their and the pluralism, secularism, all those things don't flourish, to sort of keep them down? I'm just wondering, is that a pillar of Zionism and U.S. foreign policy?
Okay, thank you. Rashid, can we be brief so we can take a few more questions?
I'll be brief. No, it is not. Well, let me put it differently. In answer to the last question, support for undemocratic regimes in the Middle East was a pillar of American foreign policy before Israel had much influence on American policy, in the 40s and the 50s, in other words, when the United States did not follow an Israeli lead on almost anything in the Middle East, and indeed into the 60s. The United States was not particularly supportive of democracy. So, and the United States has not been supportive of democracy in many other parts of the world. So this is something which unfortunately has been a feature of U.S. foreign policy. Israel has reinforced some of these negative tendencies, but I would not argue that this is a Zionist policy. This has unfortunately been an American policy. In answer to the questioner here about racism, he's actually right. I mean, there is an element of racism in this, but it does not mean that it cannot be changed, and it doesn't mean that Americans like to think of themselves as racist. Those issues have to be confronted, and those issues have to be exposed. The case of Iraq is very illustrative. I felt that the kind of pressure which was put on the administration in the last crisis over Iraq showed that, in fact, it is possible to affect even a policy which in this case I think is very much determined by Israeli interests rather than any possible American interest. And it is possible to reach the American public. I don't say we changed American policy or anybody's happy with the outcome. The outcome is still a disgrace and a scandal. It's a tragedy. But it showed that some things can actually be done. We should have done more. We should do more. But I think it illustrates the fact that even though there is some of this racism, I agree with the questioner, it is possible to have an effect.
Go ahead.
Is that brief enough?
Brief. Good, Rashid.
Hello, my name is Randa Kayali, and I was recently elected to the AAUG board, and I'm probably the youngest person. I am the youngest person on the board, and I wanted to really congratulate you all because I know that this is a panel that we organized and we really worked for, and I was personally extremely happy with what was said, partly because there were differing opinions, and this is what our community needs to know, is that we can be one community with differing viewpoints and differing exact agendas and what we want to do. And so by that, I do think it's behooved AAUG. And it's also an educational process mixed with activism, because the education that we have here is going on, and it should be ongoing. I think I came out of this knowing that I have to read more and write more letters. One issue that we didn't talk about, which I'd like to address to the panel, is the issue of Iraqi sanctions and the fact that 8,000 children or 8,000 Iraqi people are dying each month. And this is a weapon of mass destruction, as Rania Masri said yesterday. This is an issue that's pressing, very pressing, and I don't think it was really highlighted that sometimes if we choose not to speak out, people die because we're not speaking out. This is something I remember from my childhood when I was living in Beirut, and it's just something that we have to keep in mind. If we're silent, people will die. And these are our brothers and sisters that are in the Middle East. So with that, I just wanted to say that it's wonderful that everyone's standing up and saying that they're committing themselves to action and agreeing with the speakers. But I think that we all need to make individually a plan of action every week. Say, every week I will write a letter to the editor. Every single week. And I will pledge just a small portion of my income to the national organizations that are trying to organize these things. And I will organize locally. I mean, it's a sacrifice, but I wanted to thank you all, and I'd like the question of Iraqi sanctions addressed. Thank you.
Okay. I think AUG should be congratulated for putting together this wonderful panel. You would all agree that there are three areas, or at least some of us agree that there are three areas where the community, Arab American community, differs with U.S. policy in the Middle East. One of them is the Arab-Israeli conflict. The other one is the sanctions on Iraq. And the third one is that Rashid mentioned, which is the American support for those Arab regimes that do depend on U.S. largesse. And the United States rarely, if ever, criticize their violations of human rights. But we cannot really discuss all these three major important areas in one panel. But I'm sure Rashid will take the question on sanctions. Go ahead, please.
My name is Hani Bawardi. I'm from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I gave a paper. This is the best I can do.
Don't get closer to the mic, but just raise the level of your voice.
Okay, I gave a paper in this convention on early activism. My subject, Amin Farah from Nazareth, for 66 years in this country, meticulously kept all records of his activities. And one main feature of his activism is that it was a series of reactions to events and disasters in the Middle East. I'm grateful to Dr. Khalidi for his book, Palestinian Identity, because it helped me mark all the personalities in his correspondence. And it also corroborated his experience here in the States, which was a series of raising funds for refugees in the Middle East. Even when the Ottoman Empire failed and the Syrian independence took place, here it forced them, the activists were forced to pause, but never to regain any sense of national coherence. The point is we continue to rely on national consciousness to propel ourselves into activism in this country. How can we continue to do that productively while relying on our national consciousness in view of the events of the Middle East? As you know, with the founding of Israel and demonization of Arabs to sustain Israel, we're forced by a new host of problems also. And here I would like the comment of Dr. Haddad and Dr. Hagobian. On the local level, there are a set of problems pertaining to social polarization of American society. We are not part of the traditional liberal sensibility that we are part of this community. Even blacks and Hispanics and Koreans are not. There are also problems between blacks and Koreans, although there have been a lot of efforts to reconcile their differences. But the point is, how can we become part of this society given social polarization on a local level and relying on our national consciousness?
Okay, thank you. You know, we went beyond our allotted time here. Rashid, can you plug your book in the process and give us a brief answer?
My book has been very kindly plugged by almost everybody who's been up here. I don't need to do it. I think we have to do what some people said President Ford was not able to do, which is walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to do two things at once. We are not just Americans, but we're also Arab Americans, so that it is important to us if people are dying in Iraq, and so we will want to send money to Iraq. It is important to us that money be sent to Jerusalem, or that money be sent to Beirut, or whatever the crisis or the issue may be. But at the same time, we cannot let that be all that we do. We have to be concerned with cases like one that's going on in Chicago, where the rights of an American citizen are being trampled upon. He's being treated in a way that can only be described as police state tactics, because he's been listed as a terrorist by the President of the United States. An executive order has been issued. That's a case that is just now coming up again. And those are the kinds of issues we have to fight in America as Americans, using the Constitution without any reference to anything else. It has nothing to do with Arabs or Muslims or anything else. It has to do with this is a man who is a citizen and has rights. And those rights are being infringed upon, and we have to stand up for him, whether we agree with his views or we disagree with his views. Because believe me, nobody else is going to stand up for him if we don't. So we have to do both things. We have to operate in this society as Americans, and at the same time, we are concerned deeply with our homelands. And there's nothing wrong with that. Armenians are sending money to Armenia, and American Jews are sending money to Israel. At the same time, they have powerful, effective American lobbies which pay attention only to American politics. If they can do it, we can do it. So that's what I would say. And on the issue of Iraqi sanctions, I can only agree with what the questioner or Ms. Kayedi said. It's a scandal, it's a disgrace, it's something that we have to work on. But I'll repeat what I said before. I think actually this is something which we could get through to Americans on. We really could. It's something that we have to work on more.
I agree, Rashid. Go ahead, Yvonne.
I just want to reiterate what Rashid said, that I know that America is racist. I know we have a lot of forces that would like to silence us, not only us, but people who support our cause, people who understand what is happening over there. I know that there are people in the American administration who know that, one of them told me, he said, their time, they have taken over and it's their time to make policy, so that they are aware of the situation, they feel also silenced, and they need our voice. They need us to keep writing, they need us to keep talking to our neighbors, to energize our neighbors. If we choose only to socialize with each other, we're not going to break out of this self-isolation we have put ourselves into. We have to go out, participate on the local level, be seen. And there are some people in Bethesda. I went to one of the local meetings. They had people from all ethnic groups, and we as Arabs stood up and talked about the cause, and I had letters from them saying, we never knew that. It was on the day Israel was celebrating its 50th anniversary. And I stood there and I said, there are hundreds of millions of Arabs who are grieving today. And they are grieving because Israel has trampled over the rights of the Palestinians, and many have been killed. And people were shocked. But eventually they wrote me a letter and said, thank you for sharing this. They didn't know it. I didn't have to go. I could have hidden. My brother-in-law is right. That's what we have been trained. But this is America, and we are guaranteed by the Constitution that we can speak. And we should take advantage of it. This is a free country. If they are silencing us, we should speak louder.
Yeah, I would just, a couple of comments I'd like to make. First, I want to agree with Rashid, but I also want to qualify something, and then I will address the question of minorities in our national consciousness. And that is, even in the recent Iraqi situation, it was domestic resistance, there's no question, but you also must remember that the Arab states, with the exception of Kuwait, refused to cooperate. And that was even more important in some ways, or here are the two things working together. What I was trying to say is that our efforts domestically will only have real clout and will make changes in American society when there is also enough power and change and credible vision in the Middle East. As some people say, well, Saudi Arabia violates human rights, Kuwait violates human rights, Iraq violates human rights, so what are you talking about? So we need to think always in those sorts of, they come up with Arafat violates human rights. So I think that we have two tasks. And also, this answers the question of the gentleman, that while the American Constitution focuses on our individual rights, in fact, America operates in terms of groups. That's a fact. And there is absolutely nothing wrong in operating as a group. If we can get our act together here and pressure for change, at the same time, while we provide and encourage our brothers and sisters overseas to get their act together and to in some way be at least psychologically supportive, so that when we have a message here to give, it is credible that there isn't examples over there that we're essentially saying the U.S. and Israel are doing. So we need to work on both ends, and that was my message, is not to say simply that U.S. policy doesn't change. It can change, but it will not change until such time as we have these both elements, these two elements together. That's them, and I do want to emphasize that society here is really a group society, and we have not begun to act as strong as we can as a group. So I encourage that, and work with coalitions.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm afraid we have to take only two questions. One question from this side and one question from the other side. My apologies. Go ahead.
My name is Nabil Abid, and I just want to say that you have all mentioned how the United States and the Zionists have contributed to the problems of the Middle East, but none of you have said how we didn't do our best to stop these problems before they started. During the Middle Ages, where people used to come to us in Andalusia, Spain, to learn, and now they're taking land from us, and we're losing that power.
Thanks.
Najib Saliba from Worcester, Massachusetts. My question is to Dr. Khalidi. I agree that the AIPAC is fairly new in Washington, D.C., but the Zionist lobby is not. The Zionist lobby was in Berlin and then London and now in Washington, D.C. Now, if this Zionist lobby was so impotent 50 years ago, how could it influence President Wilson, the moral president, to endorse the Balfour Declaration and then to get the United States Congress to endorse the said declaration in 1922?
We have a question, a provocative question from the young man about preventive. Well, no, I'm not going to deal with that. You deal. Anybody wants to deal with that? I think. Well. No. Go ahead, Rashid. No.
Let me answer the question from over here. Yeah, Zionist movement was very effective in its diplomacy in all kinds of parts of the world. But the American Jewish community was not really as influential in this country as we like to think until 30 or 40 years ago, really. Yes, Wilson was persuaded. And yes, Congress voted in support of various Zionist positions in the 20s and 30s and the 40s. But that was cheap. That didn't cost the United States anything. That was promising Zionism something at the expense of somebody else, the Palestinians. When it came to influencing something that was absolutely vital to the American Jewish community, which was American policy going to war with Germany or changing U.S. immigration law, the American Jewish community was completely impotent. So yes, there was a Zionist lobby. It was very effective in various parts of the world before the 40s or the 50s or the 30s. I agree. My point is, this is a community which now is extremely powerful, but it was not that powerful 50 or 60 years ago. That's my only point. We are not very powerful now. We could be much more powerful very soon.
Okay. Thank you, Rashid. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Elaine. With that, we would conclude our proceedings. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again.